Welcome back for the final lecture on Paul's letter to the Romans. This is Paul's longest and most important letter, so I know you're almost tired of the letter already. But this last section, we won't spend a long time with it. There's some really good information in this section. It is the section where Paul talks about community ethics and then closes his letter. The community ethics section, chapter 12 through chapter 15, verse 6, I think. Um, that section is very similar to some of the stuff he wrote in First Corinthians when he was helping them kind of deal with some of the stuff they were facing in their congregation. And it looks like the information that he gave them. I'll move to the next slide here. This information that he gave to the Corinthians ends up being some foundational instruction that Paul has for churches from here on out. So what he kind of dreamt up and thought up in that letter and the correspondence to the Corinthian church becomes a big part of the way Paul understands the way churches should function internally. And this is where we get Romans chapter 12 through 15. Up until this point, the entire letter has been focused on theological questions, specifically issues related to Paul's gospel. What is the nature of Paul's gospel? What is the content of Paul's gospel? So once he lays that out and says, this is what I understand about Christ, this is what I understand about the Holy Spirit, this is how it relates to the law of God, this is how it relates to Jews, this is how it relates to Gentiles. Then he moves into this next section of community ethics. And he addresses this. If Paul's gospel is a gospel of freedom from the law, Paul here says that freedom does not equal immorality. In other words, law free does not mean lawless. So he spends the rest of his letter talking about just because we're free from the law does not mean we do whatever. And chapter 12 really kind of focuses in on that, specifically this mutual love as a guide to internal community cohesion. So this section really resembles 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, chapter 2, 6, and 8 of 1 Corinthians in particular, and chapter 2, 2 Corinthians, chapter 13, 11. And it may have been Paul's go-to teachings for the congregations, like I just mentioned. We're not going to spend a lot of time kind of like we did in earlier sections of Romans, picking these passages apart. But if you are a pastor and you are trying to figure out how your church should how people in the church should treat each other, this is very practical advice. Maybe it might be high belief that this is going to come to pass, but this is the community ethic. I think Paul's instruction here on how people within congregations should treat each other is really good here in chapter 12. So this is kind of internal community cohesion, internal church cohesion. And then he switches gears in chapter 13, 1 through 14, talking about how the church should function externally. So chapter 12 is how people should treat each other inside the church. Chapter 13 is how church people interact with what's outside them. And this respect towards governing authorities is kind of this guide. And this is this is a very problematic passage because I've told you how anti-Roman Paul is. And then you get to chapter 13, and he basically says, obey the government. Obedience to governing authorities is like obedience to God. Because all authority has been given to God, and God is the one who sees fit for these to rule. That does not sound anti-Roman at all. And that is a section, and this is kind of the hybrid nature of Paul. Uh, Paul, in one place, says, our salvation comes from Christ, which is one way of saying it does not come from Caesar. And then he here is specifically saying obey governing authorities. So it's that kind of hybrid nature, obey here, don't obey here, follow the law here, don't follow the law here. This is quintessential Pauline hybridity. And it goes from obey the authorities to this next section of love fulfilling the law. And here, it's very similar to 1 Corinthians 13, this love section in chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians. But it's also incredibly similar to James chapter 2, where they talk about the Ten Commandments, don't kill, don't commit adultery, and then followed up with this Levitical passage in Leviticus 19 about love your neighbor as yourself. And Paul, like James, says that fulfills the law. So it's real interesting here where he coincides with James right after he says obey the governing authorities. So Paul in one place says, before this is like, that you don't have to obey the law anymore, the law of God. And then he says, well, you do have to obey the governing authorities, though. And if you love everybody, then that takes care of everything. And then he ends this section with this very apocalyptic message, like live as though the end is near. So even Paul saying that indicates that Paul has lived a long time. He is writing Romans towards the end of his career, or end of his life, really, because we do believe that he was killed under Nero's reign as emperor of Rome, which would have been about 64. And this letter is the late 50s, early 60s. So this is one of his last letters. And the urgency here of Christ's imminent return really isn't nearly as prominent as some of his earlier writings, like First Thessalonians, for instance. In those writings, it seems clear that Paul still believes that Jesus is going to return before Paul dies. Here, you don't get that kind of urgency, and you wonder if Paul is kind of relaxing a little bit on his apocalyptic questions. And then finally, this section ends with freedom and what is right. Again, this is incredibly similar to 1 Corinthians 8 when he talks about the strong and the weak. He picks up that language here in Romans and basically says, just like he did in 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, give up your freedom for the weak in faith. If you eating meat causes them to stumble, don't eat meat because there's nothing wrong with meat, but if it causes them to stumble, that's what's wrong. So give up your freedom. Giving up your freedom would prevent you from being a stumbling block. And the strong must help the weak in this way in chapter 5, 1 through 6. So it's real interesting to see Paul revisit some core community ethic that he's already given to another congregation. And here he's rehashing, not because of anything that's happening in Rome. I mean, in Corinthians, he's dealing specifically with some issues that's happening in that church. He knows those issues. And now that kind of contextual, specific instruction becomes his concept of how churches should exist and function in the world. So that's kind of the nature of Paul's community ethics. He goes, and that's how he ends the body of his letter. He moves from that into his closing, which is pretty fascinating, honestly. He finishes with the reason why he wrote the letter, chapter 15, 14 through 21. He says here, hey, listen, I'm writing all this to let you know kind of my gospel, but also I want you to put me up for a little bit and then send me off to Spain. It's a bold ask for a congregation like that. And then he lists his travel plans in 15:22 through 23. And then this final section, he gives this extended farewell. He greets 28 people in chapter 16. That's unprecedented. It's the longest closing in any of Paul's letters where he greets all these people. And it begs the question, if he knows this many people, how has he not ever been there before? Have all these people ended up migrating to Rome, which could have been a real possibility. Just the fact that it looks like that he has never been to this church, and yet has so many people in it that he knows. A lot of people have wondered if chapter 16 was an addition, just like those letters within the letters that we found in 2 Corinthians and Philippians. Here, there is some argument about maybe chapter 16 was a different thing and then was just added to the end of Romans. The problem with that is we don't have any early manuscripts that have like a short ending. So it is interesting to kind of contemplate, but I don't know of any scholars that are like seriously arguing for this ending not being original to the letter, mainly because it doesn't make that much of a difference. But there are a lot of people Paul names. The fact is, Rome is the most important city in the empire, and many people migrated to Rome in the end. So this brings us to the conclusion of Paul's letter to the Romans. It is full of a lot of information about Paul's gospel. It's what makes it so important. It's certainly important to the development of early Christianity. None of the Gospels were written by the time Romans had been written. And it's this letter that may have prompted the need for gospel writings, in the sense that there's so much here about Paul's gospel and the way Paul understood the gospel, that it caused these early believers, these early theologians to say, you know what, we need to write down the story of Jesus. We need to write this down so that we can pass that on. And so this letter ends, I think, kind of compels this witness to kind of bear testimony to the life and teachings of Jesus that comes within decades of this letter. If you have any questions about Romans, I'll look for those in emails. I really look forward to reading your post this week. Be well.